In the oppressive heat of Guadalcanal, Second Lieutenant John George became the subject of relentless ridicule. His fellow officers had spent 6 weeks laughing at the rifle he carried, a Winchester Model 70 with a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted on a Griffin and Howe base. They called it his mail-order sweetheart. His commanding officer dismissed it as a toy. When George had unpacked the rifle at Camp Forest in Tennessee, even the armorer questioned whether it was meant for deer or Germans. George explained it was for the Japanese, but the rifle never made the initial voyage. It sat in an Illinois warehouse while George sailed to the Pacific, watching other men clean their Garands. The contrast between George's rifle and standard military issue was stark. His Winchester weighed 9 pounds, with the scope adding another 12 ounces. The Garand issued to every other soldier weighed 9.5 pounds with no magnification whatsoever. George's rifle was bolt action, holding 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic with 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry what he called a real weapon. George carried it anyway. At 27 years old, George had impressive credentials that meant nothing in the jungle. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, youngest winner in the state's history at 23 years old. He could shoot 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. But credentials meant nothing without confirmed kills, and George had exactly 0. The situation west of Point Cruz had become desperate. 11 Japanese snipers operated in the coconut groves, and in 72 hours they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. The snipers had scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle intimately. They understood how to wait, how to disappear into the massive banyan trees that reached 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. The next day, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. The battalion commander summoned George that night, his tone urgent and desperate. He needed someone who could shoot back. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could actually hit anything. George explained his credentials again: the state championship, the precision at distance. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. That night, George spent hours checking his rifle, cleaning away the cosmoline from the ocean voyage, checking scope mounts, loading 5 rounds of .306 hunting ammunition he had packed in Tennessee. The same military ball ammunition the Garand fired, but fired through a rifle designed for precision rather than volume. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. He brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle and a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. He settled in and began watching the trees through his scope. The Lyman Alaskan had 2.5 power magnification. Not much by later standards, but enough to see movement in branches that the naked eye would miss. George glassed the trees slowly, methodically, left to right, top to bottom. The jungle was never silent, filled with birds and insects and the distant sound of artillery. George had learned to filter out the noise and focus on movement. At 9:17 in the morning, he saw it. A branch moved with no wind, just a small shift 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again, and then he saw the shape. A man in dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. George adjusted his scope, 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He had spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would discover if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. George squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked and fell, his body tumbling 90 feet through the branches to hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt. the empty cartridge ejecting smoothly. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree, waiting. Japanese snipers worked in pairs, one shooter and one spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere close. At 9:43, George found the second sniper in a different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He had heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, and fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree, his rifle clattering through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded his Winchester from a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21, a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, a different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving, then inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. He found the third sniper at 11:38, 73 feet up in a banyan tree. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A fatal mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion with the speed of jungle telegraph. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused flatly. Spectators drew attention, and attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 1600 hours, he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting, and the mockery was gone from his voice entirely. He wanted George back in position at dawn. January 23rd began with heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor into mud and made the trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15. By 8:45, enough visibility had returned for work. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain, a smart move because the sound of rain masked movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer range than yesterday. They were learning his capabilities. George compensated for distance and fired. The sniper fell, the 6th kill. At 9:57, Japanese mortars began hitting the area around his bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. George understood immediately what would come next. He grabbed his rifle and ran, sprinting north along the tree line and diving into a shell crater as the third salvo obliterated the bunker he had occupied moments before. He relocated to a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The tree provided cover and a clear view of the groves. George settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon, knowing George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. The dynamic had fundamentally changed. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel between professionals. At 14:23, George killed his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment. But the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed, a mistake that cost him his life. At 1700 hours, Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers, concrete results. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue sniper operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers had been operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 were now dead, leaving 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest, the most experienced and careful. And now they knew exactly what George looked like, and exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 in the morning, he gave up and sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved gradually. George began glassing trees with systematic precision. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low at only 40 feet up. Unusual positioning, as most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He had killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, checking every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat, a banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide, with branches and vines concealing him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George made his decision. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell from the palm. George immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the shot, turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. George saw it, a slight shift as the sniper repositioned to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell, his rifle tumbling after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran, moving east along the rock line and dropping into a drainage ditch 40 yards away. He pressed himself into the mud and waited. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he had been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. George counted to 60 before moving, then relocated again to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater 100 yards east. He settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, and resumed glassing trees. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, moving toward George's position. George saw the movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground, a shape moving through the undergrowth parallel to the tree line, using ferns and vines and fallen branches for cover. The Japanese sniper stopped moving at 9:52, having reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work, the ability to remain still, to let time pass, to wait for the right moment rather than force a bad shot. At 9:58, the Japanese sniper began moving again. He crawled forward, 35 yards from the rocks, 30 yards, 25 yards. He was approaching from the south side, the side George had used when he evacuated under machine gun fire. The Japanese sniper had watched the machine gun attack and knew George had moved east from the rocks. He was now working his way along the most likely escape route, hunting George the way George had been hunting him. At 10:03, the Japanese sniper reached the rocks and moved into the machine gun nest, taking up a position facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward the area where George should have relocated. The sniper was now 38 yards from George's actual position in the water-filled crater, but he was facing the wrong direction. His back was exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass at 38 yards. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position in the rocks was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would remain there for more than a few seconds. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier 70 yards northwest of the rocks behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching and waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not 1. The 11th sniper had brought support, or perhaps these were the final 2 snipers working together. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water, submerging until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart, executing a sweep to flush George out or find his position. George remained in the water, motionless. The 2 Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently, bringing the Winchester to his shoulder. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier behind the fallen tree. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 4 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater and retrieved his spent cartridges, he heard voices. Japanese voices coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George had killed the snipers, but the snipers had not been working alone. What followed was a desperate firefight as George engaged Japanese infantry with his bolt-action rifle, killing 3 more before breaking contact and running north through the jungle under heavy fire. He reached American lines at 11:13, reported to Captain Morris, and provided a full debrief. Morris asked about ammunition status. George was down to 2 rounds. Morris told George to clean his rifle and rest, but rest would not come. The battalion commander wanted to see George. Colonel Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time and rifles with optics and men who could already shoot. Ferry had 14 Springfield rifles with unertl scopes left behind by the Marines, and 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Ferry wanted George to create a sniper section. George accepted, with one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved the request. The rifle that had been mocked as a mail-order sweetheart, dismissed as a toy, ridiculed for 6 weeks, had just changed the course of the battle for Guadalcanal. George's Winchester Model 70 had proven that a state champion marksman with a civilian rifle and a scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers in their own environment. The men who had laughed at George's rifle never laughed again. The weapon that seemed so out of place in modern warfare had demonstrated that individual skill, precision equipment, and courage could still make a difference on the battlefield. George went on to train dozens of snipers, serve in Burma with Merrill's Marauders, and eventually write the classic book, Shots Fired in Anger, that would influence military marksmanship for generations. But it all began in those 4 days at Point Cruz, when a 27-year-old lieutenant with 0 confirmed kills and a mail-order rifle eliminated 11 of the deadliest snipers in the Japanese army, one careful shot at a time.